always subscribe to the old saying, I think Groucho Marx said it, that I wouldn't belong to any club that would accept me as a member. I think this is the only way I could get in the door. In celebration, I wore one of my DNA ties. So I am enthusiastic about genetics, but I think also there are aspects of it we need to be cautious about, and we need to think about evidence of benefit before we apply things in medicine. When we think about how a new technology like this may be used in the long run, I think it's instructive to think in historical terms. Some technologies are pretty obvious in how they will be applied. And an example of that is here. This is the very first X-ray that was ever taken. That's William Röntgen's wife's hand, and that's her wedding ring. And the world literally beat a path to the door of the Röntgens to use this technology. And within months of its development, it was being used for obvious purposes in medicine. But another technology that influences us really every second of our lives, waking or sleeping, wasn't so clear in how it would be used. And that's electricity. Electricity, of course, was known by the ancients. Even, however, as late as the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin, who was famous as a scientist long before he was famous as a statesman, said that electricity is a very interesting phenomenon that will never be of any practical importance, which is fascinating to hear. And then, of course, any technology is going to be misused by those who seek to get profit, etc. And, you get some pretty funny applications of new technologies as well. And I think that in genomics and genetics today, we're somewhere in this spectrum, all right? We know some of the uses to which it will be put. We will have surprises, and certainly there's some of this going on as well. I'm surprised we don't have any genomic corsets, but those are probably not. So I want to back up, though, and I want to think for a minute about how we got here, how we've come to the point where we can literally hold a gene in our hands, where we understand the chemicals that make, to a large extent, you, and me. Because it wasn't long ago that the only way to deal with the central mysteries of heredity and genetics was through poetry and philosophy and religion. And this is a poem by one of my favorite authors and poets, as well as novelist, Thomas Hardy. And he wrote this before Mendel's laws had been rediscovered. And he really encapsulated in a beautiful, beautiful poem the central mystery of genetics. He said, I am the family face, flesh perishes, I live on, projecting trait and trace through time to times anon and leaping from place to place over oblivion. The years-arid feature that can incurve and voice and I despise the human span of durance, that is I, the eternal thing in man that heeds no call to die. He really encapsulated the central mystery of genetics, which is, there's obviously something that transmits information that makes you look like your grandmother or look like your father. Or if you're an identical twin, as I met somebody here in the audience who's an identical twin, look a lot like your sibling. And yet, it seems to jump from generation to generation, something that doesn't die. And fast forward about 50 years from when he wrote that poem, and these two guys, Watson and Crick, using data that unbeknownst to her, Rosalind Franklin, was instrumental in elucidating the structure of the double helix. They walked into a bar on a Saturday afternoon, February 28, 1953, and they announced, we've discovered the secret of life. And for once, a claim made in a bar was really true. They had it. Okay? And the question is, how did we get from a time when poetry was the only way to explain these things to a literal, concrete understanding of what life is at a very fundamental level? And we did that through the application of science. Science is a relatively new thought process that humans have engaged in. And I think it's critical for us to understand what science is, and I think it's very central to the mission of the Hastings Center, in that the Hastings Center seeks, as part of its mission, to educate the populace, to educate policymakers about important aspects of science and biotechnology. And this is an unbelievably critical mission because when you think about it, we live in a society in which our lives are dominated every second by science and technology, and yet we also live in that same culture where most people don't really know what science is. They don't know how to think in a scientific standpoint, to judge scientific evidence, and even worse, neither do our decision makers and policy makers in our country or in our culture as a whole. So I think it's worth backing up for a few slides and talking about what science is, because an understanding of life itself did not come out of the blue. It wasn't a random process. And it came out of this process that we call science that's proven particularly potent in understanding and controlling our world. And you can think back to grade school and you'll remember the central tenets of science, but they really are. Observation, hypothesis generation, measurement, prediction. Probably, to me, there are two most important, most salient characteristics of science, and that is experiment. It was really first talked about by this guy, Robert Grosseteste, in the early 13th century. He was a chancellor at Oxford, and he talked about experiments. Really the first real recorded discussion of the importance of making experiments and using mathematical models to understand things. And then the big two to me are experiment and reformulation, or the fact that science is always tentative. We are always open to revision if new evidence comes along. And it is an intensely practical endeavor. It's not a belief system. It's not predicated on faith, on adherence to anything other than a concrete requirement for results, for predictions that come true. And it's achieved, of course, a remarkable and unprecedented insight into our universe. And the fruits of that endeavor are technology. Science and technology are different. They have a very interesting synergistic relationship. When you think about advances in science, they are often spurred by technological advances. Think about Leeuwenhoek, the microscope, and what that opened up, right? Galileo looking at the moons of Jupiter. But science and technology are fundamentally different things. And again, it's necessarily tentative. And its trajectory isn't smooth, and that's a frustrating aspect of science. It's stuttering, it's uneven, we go down blind alleys. Mendel wasn't completely right. Newton wasn't completely right. And latter work then showed how it was incomplete. In the end, though, his progress has been absolutely remarkable. And I think that this has philosophical implications as well as practical implications. The success of science says something really important about the universe. It says that there's an external reality that is independent of the human mind, that is independent of even our existence, that we can gain access to through science. The quip that there are no pure social constructionists at 30,000 feet kind of sums that up. You subscribe to the notion that science does allow a powerful insight into the fundamental nature of reality that isn't subject to social forces in the way other things are when you get on a plane. Because when you get on a plane, you're counting on the fact that you didn't get on a plane designed by astrologers for a very good reason. Okay? You got on a plane designed by engineers and scientists. And there's an important corollary here. When I look at the sunrise, it's very hard for me to internalize the reality that the sun isn't rising, that I'm on a tangent, right, on this rotating Earth, spinning at about 1,000 miles per hour towards, and in some ways away from that sun, so it looks like it rises. I mean, that is just a nutty thought, and you can really understand why Copernicus was ignored for a long time. And what that tells us, of course, is that we can't always trust our own intuition about facts. In fact, our own intuition will mislead us, and science is a way of correcting for that, of glimpsing reality in spite of our lousy intuition. And it's interesting to think about why we have bad intuition, and like everything else, it comes down to Darwin and evolution, but that's a topic for another day. So here we are, flash forward another 50 years, and in about 2003, 2004, depending on where the goalposts are, we have the sequence of the human genome. This is 1/1,000,000th of the human genome. And the big problem to understanding it and using our knowledge is that it's really big, okay? This 1/1,000,000th of the genome, I could show a slide like this every second for the next 13 days, and we would only get through the half of the genome that your mom or your dad gave to you, all right? We'd have to stay here for almost a month with a slide every second. We'd have to order out for pizza because we couldn't leave before we could even glimpse the whole genome, much less understand it, right? It's interspersed with genes, or rather fragments of genes, and it's also interspersed with polymorphisms. So you differ from the person next to you, unless your twin is here, by about a nucleotide, that is one of the rungs on that DNA ladder. About every 1,000th rung, roughly, you have an A where the person sitting next to you has a T. Okay, and we call those polymorphisms, or you have a G and they have a C. Many of them are absolutely meaningless. Some of them influence traits, like whether we have blue eyes or brown eyes. Some of them influence medical characteristics, like your risk of heart disease and Alzheimer's, etc. And sometimes an individual carries a genetic change that dramatically influences their health. And probably the best example of that, the most well-known example, is BRCA1 and BRCA2, genes that when mutated cause a very high risk of breast and ovarian cancer. So what do we do with this knowledge, right? There's the very understandable criticism of any new technology that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And sure enough, we've been taking this hammer of whole genome sequencing and we've been just bashing the heck out of everything we can find. You know, there's so many species now that we have genomes on, and it's great, and we're learning a tremendous amount. But as a physician, I'm interested in how can this be used for human health? You know, what are the right nails in medicine for this hammer? Because a hammer is a really, really good tool if you apply it to hammers. And my question, again, as a physician is, how can it be applied in sick people, and how can it best be applied in healthy people? Well, in sick people, I think it's relatively clear how it will be used. It will be used as a diagnostic tool. And here's an example of a patient that we saw recently in which this approach provided important information. And when I say this approach, what I mean is our ability to sequence large swaths of the genome in a timely fashion and analyze it. She had a cardiac arrest and was fortunately resuscitated successfully. But on EKG, it revealed that she likely had a syndrome called long QT syndrome, in which a person has a very high risk of sudden death. And you know, that's a very bad disease where your first symptom, your first presentation is dying suddenly, right? She got a second chance, and the thing about long QT is that it is treatable, and you can really, really lower the risk of sudden death if you know about it and implement certain medical, pharmacologic agents. Sometimes people need an implantable defibrillator. But knowledge of which gene is mutated and has caused this in an individual has impact on how you treat them. The problem has been that up to a few years ago, I couldn't find out in my patients with long QT what mutation it was, because there's a bunch of genes that can cause long QT, and we were not up technologically to sequencing all those genes and figuring it out. But now that we can use what's called massively parallel sequencing, this next generation sequencing you hear so much about, we can figure out the mutation. We can, importantly, guide her treatment, and just as importantly, or perhaps more importantly to her, we know who else in her family, for example, which of her children are at risk, and can take preemptive measures there so that their first symptom of long QT isn't dying suddenly. Now, this slide I will show for the rest of my life, no matter what the subject of my talk, okay? This is my favorite slide ever, because it's probably my favorite research result ever. It makes you realize appreciate why you're in research. And as you'll see, it also vindicated my career in the eyes of my 26-year-old daughter. So this is a 36-year-old who was diagnosed at 6 with hereditary spastic paraplegia. She had horrible spasms of her legs that prevented her from walking. She had to use either 2 crutches, or if she was going very far, she had to use a wheelchair. She also had painful episodes every day of spasticity that were awful. It really affected her life horribly. We entered her into the study. This was her when she came on her 2 crutches going down the hall. And what we found was a mutation in the GTP cyclohydrolase 1 gene, and this gene has been described in the past in association with a disorder called dopa-responsive dystonia. And of course, the exciting thing about the name of that disease is this dopa-responsive part, because dopa is a commonly used drug. You all know people who are on dopa because it's the first-line agent for Parkinson's disease. It's a very safe drug and a very effective drug. And we called her neurologist and said, hey, you know, she really might benefit from dopa. And this is her 6 weeks later. She left her crutches at home. Okay, I felt like a faith healer, except this really worked. And then, vindicating my career in the eyes of my daughter, Cosmopolitan picked it up, along with Bad Girl Sex and Am I Normal down there. And you know, this changed her life, right? And I am not trying to say, and I really want to underscore this is not the norm. It's very unusual that you will find a diagnosis that then opens the door to dramatic treatment. But it happens, and certainly knowing something about a disorder and being able to assign somebody a diagnosis has many benefits, even if you don't end up able to essentially cure them. But if you really want to make a difference in medicine, what you would like to do is start with healthy people, right? It's kind of a drag to wait for them to be sick and then try to deal with it. But there are particular problems when we start inflicting our medical care on the healthy population. This is the world's happiest colonoscopy patient. It's Katie Couric. She got her colonoscopy on national TV. She has a very personal interest in promoting colorectal cancer screening because her husband, Jay Monahan, died at 42 of colon cancer, and he had a genetic syndrome that caused that predisposition. But there are a lot of differences between this kind of activity and treating a patient who comes to you who's sick. Healthy people, first and foremost, have less to gain than sick people. A sick person is trying to get better, right? A healthy person, by definition, is healthy. There's a different relationship between the provider and the recipient. Sick people come to us. They kind of know that the medical profession is something they would like to avoid. They're smart to try to avoid it, right? Nobody really wants to come see us as physicians. But in public health, we go to people and we say, you should do this, you should do that. The benefits are less obvious, right? It's a lot different to say, hey, you didn't get sick, instead of you can now walk again, right? It's just not as satisfying, although it's much more important in the big scheme of things. And the downsides are easy to see, and everything we do in medicine has downsides. Everything we do, no matter if it's a test or a drug, whatever, is going to hurt people, and we have to be aware of that. It's also a problem because applications are implemented en masse, right? We say everybody should do this, everybody should do that, and that means everybody has a say, including idiots, okay? Does anybody know who this is?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Jenny McCarthy, who has done, in my own view, untold harm by advocating against vaccinations. And vaccinations, for my money, are the single greatest advance in the history of medicine as far as benefit to harm. And therefore, because of all these things, policy issues are orders of magnitude more difficult. And in the end, what has to be the case, in my mind, before you start implementing things on a public health basis is that the ratio of benefit to harm has to be very high. So I think there is a new opportunity for public health genomics. I meant to have that come in later. This is me as an infant with one of my DNA ties. That was before I had my DNA tattoo, which, if you play your cards right, I won't show you. But here's the exciting thing. About 1% of the population, 1 to 2%, so perhaps somebody in this room, harbors a mutation that leads to a very high risk of a very preventable bad outcome. And an example of that would be what's called Lynch syndrome. So Lynch syndrome is a disorder in which mutations in one of 4 specific genes cause a very high risk of colorectal cancer. And about 1 in 400 people carry a mutation that does this. And here's how we find out that you might have Lynch syndrome now. We wait for you or family members to get cancer and maybe die. All right, that is a bad test, right? That's a bad way of finding out somebody might have a certain disorder. Massively parallel sequencing now allows us technically the prospect of looking at people and determining whether they have, say, a Lynch mutation, etc. And There are a number of other things like Lynch that are highly preventable if we know about them, and would otherwise confer a very high risk of a bad outcome on people. And when I add up the population prevalence for such things, I get to about 1 or 2%. And this could therefore benefit millions in the US alone. But before we start just blindly sequencing people's genomes, because what I'm really advocating is looking into sequencing very targeted aspects of the genome, there are a lot of challenges that we have to confront. One of them is what's in your genome that you want to know or don't know. So I want to show of hands here, okay? Here are some really bad genetic diseases. There are forms of Alzheimer's that are essentially dominantly inherited, where if you inherited this genetic change, you're going to get Alzheimer's. The really aptly and grimly named fatal familial insomnia, which is just what it sounds like. And let me ask you a question. And you know, what I have here is in the next 10 years. If you carry a mutation that essentially guarantees you'll develop a severe and untreatable neurological disease in the next 10 years, so it's not preventable, it's not treatable, who here wants to know? So we've got a smattering of hands. Who here doesn't want to know? Who here doesn't really know whether they want to know? I mean, it's interesting. The one disease for which we actually have data would suggest that that last group is kind of on the right track. We don't really know what we want to know. Only about, well, less than 20% of people who are at risk for Huntington's disease and understand the disease because mom or dad had it and died of it, actually go through the testing, which to me is a huge... It says something important about our use of denial, our very productive use of denial in our lives, right? I mean, if we really internalize the fate of us and everyone else we ever loved or cared about each morning when we woke up, we might not get out of bed. Have a good day. Anyway, and I think of this as value heterogeneity. The point being that as we navigate sequencing the genome, finding out about you, we're going to have to also navigate the fact that people have different feelings. Right in this room, people have different feelings. I can articulate very good reasons why I might want to do that, but I'm not sure I would actually take such a test. So there are other challenges to the appropriate use of genomics. One that I really, really lament is exaggerated expectations and claims. And that can be for many different reasons, right? It can be from very venal and nefarious reasons. It can also be just because people are overly enthusiastic. We hear this a lot. Soon everyone will have their whole genome sequenced. And I'm skeptical of that. Or if that does occur, I think it's more a triumph of marketing than it is anything else. It's typically predicated, or in the context of, it's getting so cheap, right? And what that reminds me of is the personal finance aphorism that if you have, that an elephant for a nickel is only a bargain if you need an elephant and you have a nickel, right? Just because something's cheap doesn't mean that we should buy it or we'll even want to buy it. And I think that we have to remember in medicine that even if something is free, low cost is a real illusion. And that's because misapplication of any medical test, no matter how cheap it is ultimately expensive, both in financial terms and in morbidity and mortality to individuals. The most recent example of that, I would say, is the PSA, where we're really understanding now that routine use of PSAs in everybody is probably a mistake. I think that this should be used like any medical test. MRIs are a tremendous, miraculous technology. Doesn't mean we get an MRI on everybody who comes into the office, right? Even if they were free, that would be insane. So I would add that we are not well served when your doctor or the healthcare system as a whole seeks vast amounts of data that we don't understand. Getting tests that we don't know how to interpret is a recipe for harm. It's needless, it begs for misinterpretation and overinterpretation, and there's a lot of hubris in the scientific and medical community. We think we know more than we do. And we have to be guided by evidence. And you would think that everybody would agree with that, and that would be kind of a slam dunk. But we've seen over and over in medicine that we aren't always guided by evidence when we should be. For example, it wasn't too long ago that every postmenopausal woman was put on hormone replacement therapy. And some of the data were compelling to suggest that that might be true, but the studies really hadn't been done, and when they were done, it turned out that no, we shouldn't put every postmenopausal woman on HRT. yes, some will benefit from it, but that should not be a reflexive decision. My own grim kind of reminder of that was when I was an intern. When I was in the cardiac care unit as an intern doing my residency in internal medicine, everybody who came in with a heart attack, we put on a lidocaine drip, all right? It's the same stuff they get in your mouth with at the dentist. And the reasoning was compelling, all right? It was the following. People who are peri-heart attack, right, just had a heart attack, have a lot of these premature ventricular contractions. We know that when we see a lot of these, there's a high risk for a lethal dysrhythmia. Will kill somebody. We also knew that a lidocaine infusion would suppress these. So it seemed like a slam dunk. We should put everybody on the lidocaine drip. So that's what we did. And the next year, a large study, well-controlled, came out, and it showed we were killing people by putting them on a lidocaine drip. So we did stop, which was good. But you know, the history of medicine is riddled with examples where we thought something seemed like a good idea, and before we had good evidence, we implemented it and we caused harm. And we could go into example after example. And now we get to this rise of direct-to-consumer genomic companies, right? So this technology is escaping the bounds of medicine proper. What kinds of information can you get if you spit in a tube and send it off to one of these companies? Well, you can get information about your ancestry, right? You can get information, supposedly, about your common disease risks. And you can get some kind of guidance with regard to reproduction. I want to take each of these quickly as an example. And some of it, not all of it, but some of it reminds me of Andy Warhol's quote that buying is more American than thinking. So Ancestry is one that I have absolutely no quibbles with. DNA analysis can show us just fascinating things about ancestry. I actually decided I would get my ancestry looked at the DNA level. This was about 10 or 15 years ago before they were doing sequencing. I sent $95 to National Genographic Project. And I got my mitochondrial haplogroup, and I got my Y chromosome haplotyping. And it turns out that my ancestors are from Europe, right? I mean, who would have thought? I think they're kind of interesting. We're all rather narcissistic, and we like looking at ourselves. What I would warn you about, though, is it's likely to be boring. Most of you kind of know where your ancestry is from. And ultimately, we're all from Africa anyway. I would also, just as an aside, say it's interesting to think about why we're so interested in that, right? And part of the reason, I think, is that humans have an evolutionarily predisposition to kind of banding off into groups, right? And including some and excluding others. So there's a little bit of a dark side to ancestry, but I have no problem with this. You can get very good analysis, and it's real, and it's accurate. All right, common disease is a whole other ballgame, right? What we have heard from companies is, we'll tell you about your risk of heart disease, breast cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to skip, because we don't have time, all of the reasons why they really can't, okay? It's just not even true, all right? But say it is true. Say someday we are able to really parse our genetic risk, remembering, of course, that most of our risk for common disease isn't genetic in the first place, so a robust analysis will only tell us a little. But the fact is that I know what you're going to die of, okay? It's going to be heart disease or cancer. That's true to a first approximation for all of us in this room. Some of you may get lucky and get like run over or shot, die in a tragic bungee jumping accident, right? But by and large, we're going to die of common diseases. And the question is, if we parse our risk for common diseases and say, oh, you're at relatively increased or relatively decreased risk, for a set of diseases that we know you are at absolute risk, high, right? How meaningful is that? And I would tell you, it's not very meaningful. Lots of people die every day of heart disease who are at decreased risk for heart disease, okay? So parsing relative risk just isn't very useful in the end. Moreover, everybody's going to benefit from the advice you're going to get when you find out that, hey, I'm at increased risk for heart disease, right? Well, you should eat right, you should exercise, etc. You shouldn't smoke cigarettes. So I would say that parsing your relative risk for diseases for which you have a high absolute risk is really a pointless endeavor, and I wouldn't waste my money. Now, I think a corollary of this is, how do things permeate medicine? What should be the drivers of uptake and implementation of medical tests? And I would argue it shouldn't be the market, okay? These things are often marketed with unrealistic claims, or more truthfully, as entertainment. And a friend of mine, I wish I had coined this, talked about the narcissism, right? We're very interested in ourselves. And I think that's what drives a lot of the interest in direct-to-consumer genomics. But the fact is that such analyses, genetic analyses, are complex medical tests, and they have the power to help, to harm, and to confuse. And I don't think that marketing, especially by the purveyors of those tests, is really the right way to implement broad-scale medical testing. Being the first to get your personal exome sequence is, in a medical context, I think, kind of silly and counterproductive. I would also say, and again, I'm not trying to keep anybody from getting their sequence data. I'm just trying to keep companies from lying to you about what it means. And the argument that, well, I want this medical test, it's my genome, right? That's fine, knock yourself out. You can go get it. But in the context of medicine, I have a say in what medical tests you get. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's because none of us pay for our own medical care. Whether we're in private insurance schemes or public insurance schemes, medical costs are shared. And I'll tell you, Bill Gates, I'm sure, has medical insurance, and Warren Buffett has medical insurance. So we all have a stake in this. The libertarian argument, I don't really think holds. I was speaking in Texas recently, and probably got more pushback than I will in New York about that. So no discussion of genomics is going to be complete without discussing genetics and reproduction. This ad came out, this is in the New York Times, and this ad came out in Ivy League newspapers, or Ivy League like alumni newsletters. And what it said was, we want an egg donor. We're a couple, want to have a child, and we want that egg donor to have the following characteristics. We want her to have SAT scores of over, this is true, okay, SAT scores of over 1400. We want her to be 5'10" or taller and be athletic, and the successful egg donor will get $50,000 plus expenses. This makes us feel, most of us, feel a little uncomfortable. I think it's interesting to think about why that is. I think part of it is the illusion of control. The fact is that, as most of you who are parents will tell you, we only have so much control over how our kids turn out. But I think that by changing this ad, we can also get at the root of what makes us uncomfortable. One of the ads said all of these things, and instead of $50,000 plus expenses, it just said expenses reimbursed. There's something about that I think most of us are like a little more okay with, although, it's hard to put your finger on why. But here's what you don't see, right? What I have never seen is this kind of ad, right? That I want an egg donor that's kind, creative, positive attitude. And to be honest with you, if there's one thing that I could bequeath to my kids, it would probably be this last one, positive attitude towards life, right? And yet, I have a real good friend where she and her partner were going through like sperm catalogs looking for dads because they wanted to have a kid. And it's mostly about how tall you are and what your SAT scores were. And you didn't see much of this. And these things actually can be measured. They can be quantified. So as we inch our way to designer babies, which is where this ultimately goes when one thinks it through, we are at a juncture where people are envisioning this as a reality. This is a copy of a patent that was granted by the USPTO to 23andMe last year, all right? And it is a patent for a method by which to increase the probability of having children with a given set of traits. And, they'd ask things like, okay, I want a child with a low risk of colorectal cancer. I'm not sure how many people are actually going to check off the, I want a child with a high risk of colorectal cancer. But the thing that's a little bit interesting is, look at some of the other things in here. I want a child with a low risk or high probability of blue eyes, of brown eyes, of tasting bitter, can't taste bitter, or likely sprinter, likely endurance athlete, right? And again, this makes us feel uncomfortable, and it's instructive, I think, to ask why. Because after all, we do try to optimize our progeny. And again, I think a lot of it is this, what values are we optimizing, as well as the illusion of control. But I couldn't really figure out what it was that bothered me, and I think a lot of people, the most about this until I was reading the Dalai Lama's book, The Universe in a Single Atom, and in it he says this, talking about things like designer babies. The society will find itself translating an inequity of circumstances, that is relative wealth, into an inequity of nature through enhanced intelligence, strength, and other faculties acquired through birth. In other words, we live in a society now where we can at least kid ourselves with the idea that, yeah, people have a shot at a, equal, life and a good life. And of course there are, increasing disparities, but that's still in principle hopefully true, or at least could be true. And yet, if we convert our society into one where you can convert wealth into an actual biological advantage, you've really qualitatively shifted society. And I think that's what many of us, underneath it all, find worrisome about designer babies. It's not to say that studying things like our traits is all evil. I don't think it is, and I don't think it's necessarily a recipe for a dystopia. Look at this figure. Diabetes and cancer together cost about $300 billion annually, all right? Substance abuse costs way more than that. Just substance abuse, okay? And as someone who's practiced general medicine for 30 years, my own personal belief is there is not a set of diseases that cause more human suffering than the psychiatric diseases, and especially if you fold into that behavioral or substance abuse. So finding out more about behavioral choices and impulses is important. We know, for example, that 50% of the Earth's population has inherited a discrete genetic factor that predisposes to a proclivity for engaging in risky behavior. And that's the Y chromosome, okay? And it's true, right? And the insurance companies know that, because I had to pay more for the driving insurance of my son than my daughter. Yeah, you find women who do this kind of stuff, but you find more men, right? And that cuts across all cultures, it cuts across history. Part of our risk-taking is genetically determined. And that has understanding that has obvious implications for a better understanding and possibly better handling things like substance abuse. So Caspi, along these lines, did a fascinating study where they followed over 1,000 children for 26 years, and they assessed outcomes as a function of both exposure to these children to maltreatment, as well as the genotype of a particular gene called MAOA that has to do with neurotransmitter metabolism. Well, they found that people who had this low version of MAOA and were maltreated, but it had to be both, right? So environment and genetics, had about a 3-fold increased risk of developing conduct disorder, a 10-fold increased risk of being convicted of a violent crime by the age of 26, and that 85% of these men who both had this genotype and were severely maltreated developed some sort of antisocial behavior. So you could say that the MAOA low polymorphism is a risk factor when seen in conjunction with maltreatment, or you could put it the other way, right? That a high activity version of the gene is protected from the effects of maltreatment. But all of this kind of thing leads ultimately to rather profound philosophical questions. And I tell the students that there aren't many specialties in medicine where you ultimately have to confront fundamental questions that have always been the purview of philosophy, like, is there a human soul? What is the nature of free will? Do we have free will, right? Will we someday be able to detect violence alleles that predispose to horrible violence and heinous acts and correct them, right? And I feel a little bit funny saying correct them because I'm fully aware of the baggage that comes with and the frightening prospects of that. What about preemptive treatment, like in Minority Report? But on the other hand, we already treat people, violent individuals, with very non-specific court-mandated psychotropic drugs, right? How would that be different? a better understanding of such behaviors could help us more effectively treat them. But certainly, it could also be a slippery slope towards dystopia. Unintended consequences of genetic manipulation are rather frightening to think about in a free society. It gets to thinking about what is ultimately the responsibility that people have for their actions. What would be the stigma of being labeled as an individual who's predisposed to violence? And I guess what approaching the end here of what I have to say is that science isn't going to solve these dilemmas. But I will tell you this for sure, and that is no understanding of science and an understanding of data and how to analyze it and how to think about it in rational terms will certainly be necessary to grappling with these problems. Because when we misunderstand science and when we misapply it, the stakes can be high. The power of science is really formidable. And some people want its imprimatur for, making money and doing kind of crazy things. But we also ignore scientific evidence at our own peril, right? We have the power to cause dramatic changes to our society and to our lives if we don't understand and if we misapply science. So how do we do that? How do we create a scientifically literate society? And I have two suggestions, okay? One is that it's an educational reform that would be pretty easy and would accomplish a lot, I think. I was stunned when my children, who went to a good public school system in Chapel Hill, they had to take things like trigonometry and pre-calculus and calculus. And, I took a lot of math. I was a chemistry major, but I don't use calculus and trigonometry very often. But what I do use all the time, as everybody does, is some basic knowledge of probability and statistics. And I think it's profoundly neglected in all facets of education. It's useful to everybody. Whether you're going to be watching the weather report, whether you're a policymaker and trying to judge, what kind of policies should be invoked, the press misunderstands statistics and probability all the time. And what we oftentimes hear is, well, it's really boring. It's really dry. And on the other hand, we have an entire economic structure that's based on probability and statistics. And it's very profitable because of a misunderstanding about probability and statistics, right? It doesn't have to be dry and boring. And I think that brings us to the other reform that's a little more nebulous, but I think equally important, and that is trying to teach people, whether they're adults, whether they're judges, who oftentimes went into the law because they didn't like science, right? Or whether it's children, we have to emphasize how beautiful it is. And I will submit to you that I really think that a firm grounding in science is as necessary to understanding the beauty of the world as a necessary grounding in the arts. There is a sheer pleasure in understanding our world. We literally understand what our universe was like 10 to the minus 30 seconds after it emerged, all right? And I think it only amplifies our appreciation and the beauty of things when we understand how mountains were formed, when we understand that the starlight you're seeing may be 1 million years old, traveling at the speed of light. And at the end here, I'd be remiss if I didn't address the elephant in the room when we're talking about science, and that's science and religion. It's interesting to me how much Darwin looks like God. Coincidence? I think not. I think what I would say is that a scientific view of the world is not inherently inconsistent with a belief in the existence of God, and this is empirically demonstrated because there are solid scientists who hold both views. They believe in God, and they are excellent scientists. I think religion's persistence is ensured by two things. Number one, there are inherent limits on our own understanding. We're never going to understand everything, and we have a drive to understand. So we're always, I think there will be a need for and a place for people to invoke religion. But I think it's also necessary to recognize that religion is constrained by science. The Earth is not 6,000 years old. Humans are related in a direct and non-metaphorical way to every other life form on Earth. But science, too, is constrained, right? And I think it's constrained by our own brains. So this is my main dog, Sparky, and my auxiliary backup dog, Lily. And no matter how hard I try, I will never be able to teach Sparky integral calculus. His brain is not up to the job. And it seems obvious to me that our brains are not up to omniscience. They are not up to understanding everything about the universe. Our brains have limits, okay? I love what Ken Jennings said when the computer crushed the humans at Jeopardy a few years ago. He wrote on his Final Jeopardy, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." You know, our jobs aren't up to our brains aren't up to that job. And that really leaves us with a paradox. You know, science can demonstrate our need, for example, for emotional warmth and connection, and it can explain through evolutionary biology and through neurochemistry why we need these things. It can even, perhaps, inform our quest of how to attain a life of meaning. But it's not alone going to fulfill that need, and I think for that we need each other. We need communities. I'll end with just a few other challenges just to think about. I don't have answers for these, but they come up when one thinks about genetics for even a short period. Genetic discrimination, right? Fortunately, and fortunately for my patients, fortunately for my practice, we now have robust protection against medical insurance discrimination through the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed in, I believe, 2008. But we don't have protection against discrimination for long-term care insurance, life insurance, disability insurance. So, you know, if you are born with the wrong mutation, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting these things. And that's a tough thing to navigate in society. Some countries have done it, I think, kind of in a nice way by recognizing that there are going to be things by which we're discriminated against. For example, I will pay more for life insurance because I'm male than will a woman, and that makes sense. But I would like to see some opportunity for people to be able to get some basic level of disability insurance or long-term care insurance, right, regardless of their genotype or ill luck in being born with a given mutation. So this, you know, this I kind of like threw on there as a lark a while back, and then I realized, wow, it really made sense, because the co-founder of 23andMe said in the Washington Post, okay, so I'm not making this up, we envision a new type of community where people will come together around specific genotypes, which actually has a frightening component to it. Now, I don't think she meant it in a frightening way. I think she probably meant it like, you know, people with certain diseases will come together, and that's great. But people have a very seedy, we have a very sordid history of coming together around genotypes, and we have to be very careful about that. Gene patenting was largely put to rest in this country by the Supreme Court in June of 2013 when they ruled that human genes are not eligible for patenting. That's not universal. Canada is now bringing a suit. There are people in Canada bringing a suit to try to get a similar decision in Canada because that's not the law in Canada. Although we can't patent genes, we can keep data secret, and I think that's a big problem because the only way we're ever going to understand the genome is by sharing data, especially data built on the backs of sick people who had testing and would want, by and large, those data to be used for the general good. There are privacy issues. Your genome is a digital code. That's not a metaphor. It's an actual digital code of information. We are really good at manipulating, hacking, disseminating digital codes, right? And we now, in this paper, a group looked at public databases and DNA sequences, and in about 20% of the time, they could come up with a name, phone number, and address from a DNA sequence, okay? Which has interesting implications. If you're a prosecutor, right, in the criminal justice system, your eyes would really light up with the prospect of maybe that, you know, blood stain actually contains a phone number and an address and a name. On the other hand, they had about an 18% false positive rate, which is frighteningly high in the criminal justice system, right? And I love what Scott McNeely said about privacy. He said, privacy is dead, deal with it. And I actually think that's true. I think privacy is dead. What we have to do is we have to deal with the implications of that. We have to figure out how to construct policies that discourage the misuse of it and to encourage proper and responsible use of the kind of data that are floating around about all of us. And finally, one of the direct-to-consumer genetic companies that went bankrupt, one of the Chapter 11 formulations being envisioned by the bankruptcy court was that all of the data that was owned by Decode on the people who had sent DNA to them would now become the property of a venture capital firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Not probably what the people who spit into the tube thought about. So, we have to think about who's going to have control and access to that information. I'll end with a comic that Hilary Price did about the dangers of modern genetics. Create a dog that's scared of cars, that's clean enough to enter bars, who never would a cat mistreat, whose breath's forever minty sweet. But first, before we splice a gene, let's think about the unforeseen. Our good intent to hybridize could engineer a bad surprise. A dog who might be quick to judge, or God forbid, who holds a grudge. Who leaves behind its role traditional and offers only love. I love and I want to thank all the tremendous people that I work with. So, thanks a lot.
Jim, we couldn't have asked for a more spectacular talk. Thank you so much. And yes, the floor is open for questions. And we're recording this, so should I repeat? Oh, there's another mic. Good. Yes. Okay.
Oh, I guess nobody disagreed with anything.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a good talk. I've heard it claimed that one of the technological possibilities is closer than we would ever imagine, namely to somehow overcome the sort of built-in lifespan of the human organism. And I think that would raise many serious ethical questions. Is that true, that that's something that's more within reach than maybe some of these other pie-in-the-sky aspirations, and B, are people in the genetics field talking about the ethical import of that?
I think, it's really interesting. I've always been interested in aging, lately more so. And I used to think it was really science fiction, and I don't think so anymore. I think we are learning enough about the fundamental mechanisms of aging that I don't think it's science fiction to think that we could meaningfully intervene with our lifespan. Like you say, I think that brings up unbelievably challenging issues, right? I mean, just go into any nursing home right now and think about that. And one of the big questions would be, are we going to find out that our extension of lifespan doesn't come with decreased morbidity, right? Are we going to live to 120 that live pretty lousy lives those last 30 or 40 years? And I don't see much discussion of that. There are products out there based on very scanty evidence that purport to, probably increase lifespan. I mean, real extrapolation of data on, for example, yeast. But I don't see a lot of ethical discussions about that. And I think that it's the kind of thing that would make sense to start thinking about, because I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't fantasy, if it wasn't science fiction in another 10, 20 years. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the projections of Ray Kurzweil
Mm-hmm.
and the singularity? And I just wonder your comments and perspectives on
Yeah.
that as to how it would relate.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the questions about the work of Ray Kurzweil, who is a billionaire, I think, many times over, because he invented some sound systems that are used in electronic music production and synthesis. But he wrote a really interesting book. He's written a lot on this, but the book I found most interesting was The Age of Spiritual Machines, in which he postulates that we will become part, cyber, right? Part computer, part artificial, right? The singularity, yeah. And to me, his most compelling argument is that he argues that technology accelerates at an exponential pace. And that does seem to be true, right? Change seems to happen more rapidly in technology. Where I think what he ignores, and I really find this interesting, if you read The Age of Spiritual Machines, he makes these projections that are now have not come to pass. What people miss, I think, oftentimes as futurists, is the cohesiveness of society and economic kinds of forces that limit our potential. Society's fragile, right? We live in a very fragile society, and we have always seen setbacks, sometimes horrible setbacks if you look back to, 400, right? And I think he had completely ignored the societal kinds of infrastructure that we require to take advantage of these technological things. So I think he's a really interesting read, but I would take a lot of his stuff with a grain of salt. Or I do, I don't know.
Well, as you know, he's selling all types of
Oh yeah.
medicinal
Oh,
things
exactly.
to try to
And-
get you to continue
Right.
your lifespan until the machines arrive.
Yes,
and
yes.
Synthesize and
It's
make
like,
it
the
go forward.
rumor, I'm not saying this is true, but isn't the rumor that Walt Disney is frozen somewhere?
Sure.
Roger Maris is
Outdoor
head.
life is
If
dead
you
weight.
can't afford to freeze your whole body, freeze your head, right?
Dead weight.
Is that right? Ted Williams, not Roger Maris.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Is religion a major part of your life? Is religion and science at odds here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I don't know if any of you listened to Leonard Cohen, the musician, songwriter, poet, right? He said in one interview that religion is his hobby, right? And I would say religion plays a very important role in my life. Not that I subscribe to any kind of factual tenets of a religion. I don't think any of the religions, that's a very hubristic thing to say. I don't think they got it right. Not that I'm saying I know what right is, right? But I think that there is such mystery in the universe, and I think science is ultimately limited. But I will tell you this. Religion has to be constrained by science because science will tell us things that are true and are not true. And truth is a slippery
But
phenomenon.
in today's world, does religion actively come against science like it did in Galileo's time?
That's interesting. I think religion is at odds with science in some of its formulations. So I think that it certainly comes up against, in a very adversarial way, it comes up against it if you're talking about fundamentalism in the sense of Christianity, of Islam. I think most people can comfortably reconcile religion and science, and I think that most religious institutions are not at odds. They have kind of wisely separated themselves because, religion has lost over and over again going up head-to-head against science, right? So I think religions have wisely, distanced themselves from science, although some have persisted in making an issue out of it, and those people are simply wrong, I would say. The people who don't want to teach evolution in the schools, the people who think that the Earth is 6,000 years old, they're just wrong. And I think that the wise people who seek spiritual fulfillment in their life, they recognize the limits of religion and the limits of science.
Yes, Joe, and then Blair.
Thank you. As a doctor, how do you reconcile the timeline question between all this promise, all this potentiality, notwithstanding the complexity of it never being realized, and real families having sick kids or sick loved ones who we can't even sequence the genome of a simple malignancy. How do you deal with they're always in different time zones?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, right? Because in the study, what I of course didn't show you because it's not cool and it's depressing. I didn't show you slides where we either get no answer in somebody with a devastating disease, or even harder sometimes is we get an answer. What I'm quick to tell people when we arrive at a diagnosis, that in most cases, you know what? And I tell them before they can ask, because they're going to ask. This isn't going to help your child. I'm afraid in your child's lifetime, this knowledge is not going to help them in a tangible way. Now, it will help them in the sense that they don't need to go to doctor after doctor and get test after test looking for an answer. We got an answer for you, but I'm afraid it didn't come with any effective treatment, and that's a horrible thing. And this is actually, what you got to is probably the most powerful thing that motivates me to want a scientifically literate populace. People have to understand both the power of science and what it's really like. And what it's really like is it's slow, you go down dead ends, you make U-turns, it's frustrating. And you read all the time about breakthroughs and this is going to lead to a treatment. And you know what? It's a long, slow, agonizing process. And on one hand, we can't throw out the baby with the bath. We can't get discouraged and say, well, we're just not going to do science, because frankly, it's our only option, right? But people have to understand that it's a slow process, because we need to fund science and we need to pursue science. It's our only hope to cure these diseases. But if we set expectations too high, people are gonna, it's like the human genome. So how come it didn't cure all these diseases? Expectations were raised too high for the human genome. And that's why we need people to understand that. But it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Claire.
In the late 1960s, there was a huge battle within NIH between the typical approach to, about cancer.
Yeah.
The war, Mary Lasker,
Right.
the war on cancer, and there was a whole group who had a very thoughtful algorithm, a whole war room of all the things. If you knew this, you could then very much top down, using the best brain power on the planet. And there was the let 1,000 flowers bloom. Most of what we've discovered that matters. People was looking. Louis Pasteur was looking for A and found B. As you look at this universe, and if you were czar for a few days, how would you?
I want the job for a month.
How would you lead is there an intelligent investment strategy in creating incentives or rewards to go after the real issues Joe brought up that really affect real people's lives tomorrow, and not the electric corset or whatever?
Yeah.
And how would
So
Would you
I think that's a really good question, and I'm fortunate to sit on what's called Council for the Genome Institute, the NIH Institute that deals with genetics. And this is a constant, as it should be, of an appropriate tension in where do you invest money, right? Do you invest money in things that, okay, we can see where the payoff is, and this is what we're going to do, and it's all top down? And how much do you invest in just people doing basic research? And I guess what I think is we are in danger of not investing enough in basic research. And I'm a very applied guy. I'm a physician. I want results, and I want, but we have to recognize that a substantial part of our budget has to be put into basic research on flies and worms and bacteria and mice. And it's not that we also don't need to invest in applied stuff, but I think that we're doing that. If we're in danger, I think we're in danger of not putting sufficient resources into basic science.
David.
Jim, I wonder, you mentioned the Human Genome Project and the 12 years it took. We've now launched the so-called BRAIN Project. Do you see any insight to be gained in the way that's going to unfold with the genetics and so forth? I mean, what are the relationships between that whole thing that's still in front of us and what we've learned out of
I
it?
think there's one thing that we can learn as I think about it. One is, I would hasten to add, I think the Human Genome Project was brilliant and has resulted in much good. What I think was oversold was, it's going to cure diseases in the next few years. I mean, that was crazy from the start, and I don't think it serves us even selfishly well by propagating those exaggerations. But I don't want to leave people with the idea that I think the Human Genome Project, I supported it at the time, and it has been a huge boon to our understanding of life and will be to medicine. Now, the BRAIN Project, I think that the biggest challenge with the BRAIN Project versus what we had with the Human Genome Project is the Human Genome Project was kind of like the moonshot. We knew the goal, We kind of knew how to do it, and it was a matter of scaling up and putting the resources in and doing it.
3 billion.
There you go. We know, we can sequence, I can sequence in the lab 300 bases in a day. If we scale this up enough, we can sequence all 3 billion. We knew we could do it, right? And it propagated tremendous advances in technology and insights. What I would do if I were in charge of this, and I'm not, is that the thing I would try to keep focusing on with the BRAIN project is to have our goals defined, right? So define some doable goals. Even if they're big goals, make sure they're doable, right? Don't just say, we need to understand the brain. That's such a big question and such a nebulous proposition that it's meaningless, right? But if the answer becomes, we need to map the neural circuitry, right? And how it changes through development, okay, now you start, so I would say what you need are concrete problems you can sink your teeth into. Noam Chomsky said, there are problems and there are mysteries. A problem is something you can kind of get your head around, right? And those are the things we can plan. We can plan an attack on, right? And then there are mysteries, and the only way to ever address mysteries in science, I think, is by letting 1,000 flowers, I forget what Miles said, bloom. We need to just let people do basic research, driven by curiosity, and we will ultimately stumble on important things as we employ that process of science.
Michelle.
Thanks so much for a great talk. One of the kind of weak links in the cultural understanding of research results in science is the reporters, journalists, and the media who overstate the case from the very beginning. And the Hastings Center has research scholars who have played a role in trying to remedy that. But I wonder if you think there are sort of nationwide initiatives that we could undertake to maybe make reporters better educated, and are there any people who are doing it well? That would be the second part of my question.
That's a tough one, right? That's a tough one. I think that as
reporters.
an editor of a journal, right, I've become uncomfortably aware that controversy, right, kind of sells, right? So I think the press, understandably, they seek controversy, they seek bold claims. What I think we have to do, we're not going to fix that, right? I don't think we'll fix that. What we have to do, I think, is two-prong attack. One is we have to get scientists to both understand science and speak of it in an articulate and sensible fashion. Because, most of the reporters I dealt with, especially with, good newspapers and good news outlets, they're pretty careful. They really are good. I rarely actually run into reporters who were idiots or who were, just ignoring reality. More often, it's the quotes they're getting that are just lame, right? Or exaggerated. So I think we have to train scientists and we have to train the public so that they can read a story and go, wait a minute, is this really the breakthrough that's going to, in 3 years, cure cancer? They need to be skeptical, right? Yeah.
Well, that is a great last line. I think we should allow Jim a break.